Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to another edition of Fermentology. So happy to have you this week. I'll just give a few more moments. I see the tally is still ticking up in the Zoom room. And those of you on YouTube, hello, welcome again. Great, I think we're starting to level out a little bit. Right, well, as always, welcome. This is Fermentology. This is our semi-weekly mini seminar series on the culture, science, and history of our everyday fermented foods. And I'm Michelle Jewell, and I'm based at NC State in the Department of Applied Ecology as their lead science communicator here. And today I'm joined by two incredible researchers, a historian and a cognitive scientist, Chad Luddington and Ann-Sophie Barwich. And they're going to be talking us through everything to do with wine. No cheese, unfortunately, this time around. But they're going to talk to us about if we have the same taste and cognitive abilities and smell abilities as those professional wine tasters that you see, the sommeliers. And Chad's going to be talking to us about the history that we're smelling when we take in the notes of a Bordeaux or another type of wine. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the talk. So whether you're watching on Zoom or YouTube, feel free to use the chat functions. If you're in Zoom, you're going to use the Q&A function to put in your questions. And you don't have to wait to the end of the talk to put your questions in. You can do that as you have them. And then at the end of the talk, I'll be picking out some questions that we have time for them to answer, and I'll ask them live. So please do put your questions in. But I do apologize, I won't be able to get to absolutely everybody's questions during this time. And without any further ado, I will pass it on to Chad and Ann-Sophie. Thanks so much.
Let me just share my screen here, folks.
And also, thanks for having us.
And
oh, thanks for being here.
So first of all, I want to thank Michelle and for inviting us here today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and I know Ann-Sophie is in full agreement with me, and that is wine. Some of you were understandably led to believe we'd be talking about cheese too, but when we thought about the timing, we decided we'd only address one of these two subjects, and that is wine, which is perhaps the most famous of all fermented products. So I'm going to talk a little about why I find wine so fascinating. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what wine tasters do. So let's begin with fascination, at least for me. And I hope you, by 5 minutes down the road, you'll agree with me that this is very fascinating. But I want to focus particularly on Bordeaux wine. That's perhaps the area I know best, not only in my studies, I've lived there for a while, and indeed, I enjoy drinking Bordeaux wine. I suspect many of you do too. Bordeaux is also famous, even if you don't know why it's famous, you probably know Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot grapes. So it's the home of those two grapes. We're going to talk more about those in just a minute. But one of the questions I want to begin with is, how did Bordeaux become such a famous winemaking region? After all, wine is made all over Europe, especially in the southern climates. It's made in Central Asia, where grapes are in the Caucasus. It's of course made in Australia and South Africa and South America, in North America and California in particular. But why did Bordeaux become so famous? Well, the first reason is because Bordeaux has long been made for export markets. So I'm having a little trouble getting to the next slide. You see our names there, thank you. So Bordeaux has long been a wine that was made for export markets. And in particular, that's because in 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine married King Henry II of England. And she brought with her in her impressive dowry the entire territory of what is now southwest France. And that included the city of Bordeaux, which is about 75 kilometers down the river from the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a port city, although it's protected by the river. It's also an area that was already making wines even prior to 1152. But the key thing is, those wines very early on were being made for an export market, which meant that they had to survive the rigors of a sea voyage and they had to cater to the taste of a foreign audience, in particular an English audience, secondly an Irish audience, because Ireland, the Kingdom of Ireland, belonged to the kings of England going back to the 11th century. Moreover, when those wines made it to England, they were then often re-exported across the Channel in the North Sea to the Netherlands and to ports throughout what is today northern Germany and Scandinavia. And all those different markets had slightly different desires for what they wanted in their Bordeaux wine. Some of them wanted more red, some of them wanted more white, but the English were the primary market for Bordeaux wine. The local market wasn't nearly as strong as the export market. Well, that began to change. That is, the export to England began to change in terms of the quality of the wine in the 1660s. Now, England lost possession of Aquitaine in 1453 when they lost the 100 Years' War. However, they continued to drink wines from the Bordeaux region. Yet, in the 1660s and 70s, what happened was a sequence of both tariff wars between England and France, as well as actual wars. So the French government, in an attempt to protect its own cloth manufacturing market, put a high tariff on English cloth, which was England's greatest export to France. And the English retaliated in 1678 with their first among many embargoes on French wine, but then those were followed by high tariffs on French wine. The result was that producers in Bordeaux, in order to get their wine to the English market, because it had a very high flat tax, regardless of the quality of the wine, Bordeaux producers had to make a wine that was worth the while of consumers to pay the extra tax on, or the high tax on. In other words, if you're buying a wine and half of the cost of the wine, or even more, is in tax, you would rather not purchase it. You'd rather purchase a wine where the tax was a smaller percentage of the overall cost of the wine. So the incentive is to improve the quality of the wine, which is precisely what happened in Bordeaux. And the wine became darker and more concentrated. Traditional Bordeaux wine was pink in color. We'd call it a rosé, a dark rosé. It became dark in color, like you see here, what we consider a red wine. Just before we move from this slide, on the right-hand side, you see probably the most probably the best document I've ever found in the archives, and that happens to be the cellar book of King Charles II. And this is open to page in 1660, the year he was restored to the throne in England. And all of those details are in Latin, but they have to do with his wine purchases, including a wine called Haut-Brion, which became the model for high quality Bordeaux wine. And it remains one of the most famous of all Bordeaux wines today. Well, as I said, with greater profits coming in to the French producers, they began to invest more in the vineyard itself to make better wine, which would then fetch ever more money on the English market. And one aspect of creating that better wine was to cull various grapes that had been grown in Bordeaux. That is, to get rid of many, many varieties of grapes. There were dozens and dozens in the Middle Ages, that is, types of grapes in the Bordeaux region. And over time, as Bordeaux moved toward quality to reach that English market, what happened is they winnowed the number down to 5 grapes. Predominantly Merlot, which is the most commonly planted, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Although that combination really came into play in the 18th century, the end of the 18th century in particular. But what you have again is this drive toward quality, which is reducing the number of types of grape that are grown. And as I said, the two dominant ones are Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, Merlot being planted more than anything else. But on the left bank of the Gironde River, which becomes the Garonne River here, everything to the left, the west of the arrow there, focuses more on Cabernet Sauvignon with a minority of Merlot. The exception is in the white wine growing regions, for example, down here where they make sweet white wine, the most famous of which is Sauternes. On the right of the river, that is in the so-called right bank or east of the river, that's Merlot country, where Merlot is the dominant grape, and Cabernet Franc is the minority grape, although sometimes they use Cabernet Sauvignon a little bit too. Now, why they plant grapes in different places has to do with the soil, it has to do with the heat, and which grape ripens faster, which one needs more sunshine and heat. That's Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. Merlot needs a little less heat to ripen. And they also have different flavors, so they bring different things to the wine. In particular, Merlot is often thought to bring or smell like and taste like plums. The mouthfeel is kind of jammy, especially if the grapes are very ripe. Although historically in Bordeaux, they haven't grown the Merlot or let it stay on the vine long enough to get the really jammy flavors you get in a lot of New World Merlots. Instead, sometimes there it can have a little more of a strawberry flavor. It also has a high level of acidity. Cabernet Sauvignon, on the other hand, again, the dominant grape on the left side, the left bank, the west side, is often thought to smell and taste like black currants. People also detect cedar, as well as pencil shavings. And then Cabernet Franc, which, by the way, is a parent to both of those wines. That is, Cabernet Sauvignon is descended from Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. It was a random occurrence in nature that produced the Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon grape. So a white grape and a red grape produce a red grape Cabernet Sauvignon. But Cabernet Franc was one of the two grapes, the parents. It was also a parent of the Merlot grape. So Cabernet Franc is often thought to bring cigar box flavors or tobacco flavors. Sometimes violets are described, and perhaps less attractively, green pepper, bell pepper, a flavor that I actually find unappealing in wine, but some people, I confess, like it, and that's certainly their business. So all Bordeaux wines, again, are made with a combination of grapes. That's done in order to hedge against different types of weather. Burgundy, by contrast, goes with one grape. For red, it's Pinot Noir, and for white, it's Chardonnay. There's an exception to that, but I won't go into that. In any event, these are all the flavors that people get, often say they get in these grapes. But critically, the question I want to ask now is, what's going on with, or how do people taste these flavors that I just talked about? What do they do? And so I'm actually going to stop sharing here, go on to this. Oh, I forgot to change my slide in time. Aromas and flavors. You see a picture of the Cabernet Sauvignon grapes there. Small grapes, tightly packed, and then I've given you the some of the flavors that one gets from Bordeaux wines, not just from Cabernet Sauvignon, but from Bordeaux wines in general. So now I want to do is just switch from historian mode to taster mode and just say, talk a little about how one tastes a wine. So I'm stopping sharing there, and instead I'm going to pour some wine for myself, which I did, and say that we begin when we taste wine, first of all, by making sure the glass is clean. Now, maybe you can't see on your screen, but this glass is clean, although it's got wine in it. I poured, in fact, some Bordeaux wine. This is a 2011, not considered a great year. 10 years old, though. For Bordeaux, that's pretty good. Often it takes some time to age. So what do? First of all, I like to swirl it from the start. But then we hold it up to look at the color, because wine comes in first through the eyes before anywhere else. So we look at the color. Is the color pretty? If it's not pretty, that actually affects how we taste the wine. But let's say we find it a pretty color. Often it's described, Bordeaux is described as red brick in color, especially if it's older. It begins to turn brown, slightly brown as it ages. But then after looking at the wine, having it enter through our eyes, it enters through our nose. We smell it. We try to think of what we get in the wine, what flavors, and it helps to think of some of those that I just mentioned before. Here, I feel I'm getting a lot of plum and some cedar. No tobacco yet, but I just opened it. Sometimes that takes time. Well, then comes the fun part. you taste it. While you're tasting it, try to suck some air in. Let that activate both the wine and your own senses. And then if you're a professional taster, of course, you're going to want to spit out, because if you did this with 50 wines and you're trying to rate them all, you would soon find yourself falling down. But for someone like me right here, a little bit early perhaps, but nevertheless, I went ahead and swallowed the wine, and I'll enjoy the rest of the night at dinner. But now I want to ask Ann-Sophie, what's really going on? We got the background, that gives us some of the depth and the meaning of wine. It's exciting, it has this history, and that's, it's quality that drives Bordeaux to use grapes that it sees as noble, as the best grapes, Merlot, Cab, Cabernet Sauvignon, that is. But what's going on when we actually taste wine? What's happening in the brain?
So this is where we switch gears to the sciencey part, and just to make sure, can you see the screen? Perfect. As you nicely actually illustrated, this is about sensing material history, the complexity of the materials we are smelling and tasting. And the first thing to realize is that we're actually having not one, but two senses of smell. That's often undervalued, just how complex our sensory apparatus is. And these two senses is, on the one hand, the so-called orthonasal olfactory perceptual system, which is what we usually associate with smelling, the inhaling, the sniffing, often referred to as the fragrance perception. And we have a second pathway, which is the retronasal pathway associated with flavor perception. And they work similar yet different. So when you have, for instance, just the sniffing, the inhaling sense, what happens is that you've got very light airborne volatile molecules entering up the nose, the nasal cavity, and interacting with the olfactory epithelium here, which contains the sensory neurons leading directly into the brain. And these sensory neurons have the receptors, they touch and tango with these molecules, and there's a combinatorial interaction going on, meaning you've got one molecule interacting via different molecular features with different receptors, and one receptor can actually be activated by different molecules with different features. Why I'm saying that is actually you have a combinatorial explosion at your nasal epithelium. That's why you can smell so many different kinds of things. Compared to color, where you've got a certain set of things you can discern, with molecules, it's a plethora of everything smells. And the reason that you can detect all these different nuances of smells and categories of smells is because of the combinatorial explosion at the epithelium. And that sends a signal then to the first relay station of the brain, the olfactory bulb here at the frontal lobe of your brain, where the signal then is sent further to the olfactory cortex. So this is actually a fairly straightforward pathway. This is two synapses from the ear to the brain. Just by comparison, two synapses don't even get you out of the retina and vision. So this looks like a simple pathway. The devil in neuroscience is in the details. The reason why there's still many unresolved questions about how we smell is because there's a lot of details going on that might not be so simple. But that's the basic pathway. And from the olfactory cortex, you have the signal further interacting with other areas, such as, for instance, the amygdala, which is involved in affective responses. So that's one of the reasons why there's a close tight interaction between odor perception and judgmental evaluation. Do we like something? Do we dislike something? What kind of response do we have with it? That's the key pathway when we think of sniffing. But there's a second sense, and that's when you eat. You basically, when you eat, you chew, you've got airborne volatile molecules, again, released from the food, and that travel back through the back of your throat up to, again, the nasal epithelium, where again, you've got the same process going on, except for the fact that it doesn't stop there. There's suddenly this multimodal, cross-modal firework, neural firework in your brain. Because flavor, most of it is smell, sure, but you also have the cross-modal interaction with taste, with touch, with temperature. There are kind of different aspects, often summarized as mouthfeel. But as Chad said, you also have the visual sense. You see a color that raises certain expectations of what you think you're perceiving. Or also auditory things. Is it crispy? Is it crunchy? Is it kind of slurpy? All these things, your brain basically integrates together into this sensation we call food flavor. Now, the question is, of course, to what extent then wine experts are able to perceive so many different kinds of things if we have the same apparatus. And the reason why so many people are so skeptical about sommeliers and wine experts is because they sound slightly fancy, and you can't possibly perceive all that much in wine. It's wine, it's red, it's white. Where do you get all these nuances from? And why can these people say there's pencil shavings in a wine? I mean, nobody really put them in. And the reason why many people are skeptical about wine expertise, or also other expertise such as perfumery, or also cheese experts, coffee tasters, whiskey experts, is that we often think of smell as having this kind of stain of subjectivity, because you and I, we do perceive things differently sometimes, certain aromas or certain smells, and even you yourself sometimes can perceive the same thing differently at different times. So we think it's subjective. I want to convince you to remove the stain of subjectivity, actually, and to rethink it a little bit. Because why do we think smell is subjective? Well, we kind of adopted that idea from the visual system. We have an object, we see it, we describe it, and we have the same terms to describe that object. And we consider what's objective is we all find the same words and categories for the same thing. Turns out that's very difficult with smell. You have, on the one hand, lots of molecules. I mean, there's no fixed number in terms of how many we can perceive, but some people even suggest that it might be up to 1 trillion odors that humans can discriminate. The number is slightly contested, but I think the official number is shit tons. So there's a lot of stuff we can discern, but how do we describe it? Well, quite often we notice that we use different words for the same molecules, for the same mixtures. The thing is, with words, is don't get sidelined by the labels and the words. Words are not perceptions. Words are basically what we agree our perceptions are, the categories. Why are we having so many different kinds of words for the same things is the question then. Well, one thing to understand is that variation between us, variability, is not the same as subjectivity. Subjectivity is something we think is in our heads. It's somehow unaccounted for by objective causes. You know, everybody's different. Not quite. There is variation between people. The question is, does the variation have the same causes? Can we actually find common causes of why we are experiencing the same things differently at times? Turns out we can, because what we often forget when we look at molecules and perceptions is the thing in between, the organism, the biology and the psychology. And there are 3 examples to hammer that point home, which are my favorite examples, actually. The first one is, and it was a real experiment in 2001 by the psychologist Rachel Hertz, who gave people 2 vials, identical vials, same liquid, different labels. One was called Parmesan, the other vomit. Well, which one would you smell? Chances are you pick the Parmesan. The thing here is that people are convinced these 2 bottles actually really smell different. But they had the same mixture, a mix of isovaleric and butyric acid. And you might think, well, that just shows how subjective it is, isn't it? We can fool our sense of smell. No, actually not. It just shows that we can shift our mental imagery, because it turns out that the olfactory stimulus is often promiscuous. Butyric acid, for instance, both has the smell of Parmesan and vomit, because the same molecules can come from a variety of different sources. So the perceptual meaning of a chemical, of a smelling molecule, comes from its context. So there's a semantic ambiguity with many odorous molecules. Your brain measures the context, and it uses cross-modal cues such as verbal labels or images to hone in on what that might be. That's one thing. The other thing is also, it's not just that there's a promiscuous stimulus when it comes to the chemistry, but there's also genetics involved. The olfactory system is one of the most genetically diverse systems, and these genetic differences can lead to variations in our perception. My favorite example here is coriander or cilantro. You often, when you have like big dinners at these pre-pandemic times, big dinners, you often have this one person who's like, yeah, I don't like cilantro, it's kind of soapy and pungent. That person is not a picky eater or somehow difficult. People who have a different perception of cilantro as soapy, as pungent, and not fresh and green, they have a mutation near one of their olfactory receptor genes, leading them to have a different perception of it. And genetics is a pretty good explanation for it. But the last example is even more mind-boggling. And I really say mind-boggling because that's really my favorite example by now, is a molecule called androstenone, which is also a pig pheromone. And it does more than just, have pigs smell sexy to each other, but it also can be smelled by humans, and some humans can smell it, some humans cannot. And those who can either like it or dislike it. So to some it's pleasant, to some it's unpleasant. To those to whom it's unpleasant, they either say it smells urinous. Other people who don't like it say it smells like body odor. So even though they have a similar negative association with it or negative perception of it, they have completely different mental imageries of it, qualitative descriptors. You have some people who like it because they say, oh, this is a very nice woody smell. Completely different. Other people say, it's very floral. So you have 4 completely different ways of perceiving the same thing. And it turns out it's, again, back to genetics. So there is a biological foundation for how we perceive and why we think certain things are so different between us. The question now is, what does that tell us about wine tasting as a skill? Well, it tells us we need to understand both the biological and the cognitive mechanisms to see what these people are doing, the experts, because when you think they can't possibly smell pencil shavings, or sometimes you read about cat piss as a descriptor for wine, or you even read like diesel or petrol for Riesling. So I thought instead of a Bordeaux, I'm going for Riesling because I'm German and that's my favorite wine, just to kind of counter against the French. But the point here really is that perception is a skill. And what you're detecting is not just simply single molecules. No, you train yourself. You train your brain to categorize certain things, to pull them out of a complex mixture. And what wine tasters do, for instance, they don't do this just once in a while. They really train themselves, focus on it over quite a long time. Expert sommeliers over a decade. So it's like learning a new language. You learn the vocabulary and you get a library of certain wine profiles. Because smelling has a lot to do with memory. Can you hone in? Can you focus on something? And the psychologists call this figure ground segregation. Can you pull out certain qualitative features from your memory? So it's deductive smelling. It's like Sherlock Holmes. So when Chad said, like, you look, for instance, at the color of the wine, you form a first hypothesis. You look at, well, is there an oily film? Is there perhaps more an orangey film? That already gives you an idea. Like there might be kind of a thicker oil layer first hypothesis. Then you swirl it, you smell it. You have 1 or 2 notes that stick out to you, already saying, okay, this might be this wine or that wine. And then because you have this library in your head, you can test, you can train your brain to find certain notes to see, is it this, is it that, or even is something absent. So sometimes you hear Riesling experts say, I don't detect oak. And you think, why would they say I don't detect oak? Well, the reason is because German Riesling is stored in oak barrels. Australian is not. So there you already know which continent the wine might be from. So what you're having is a highly cognitive procedure. And you might say, well, you can tell me kind of anything here. I mean, well, this is just behavior and there's this black box of the brain. Turns out that these changes, these skills, perception as a skill is also traceable in the brain. Because when you train yourself, when you train your brain to detect these nuances in wine, it actually alters not just simply your mind, but also your brain. It turns out that smell experts have certain areas in the as part of the olfactory cortex that literally get bigger. They thicken. The gray matter thickens. And this nice thing is it also can happen to you, because one of the cool things about the olfactory system, it's the most plastic system of the brain. Plastic meaning flexible. It learns pretty quickly. And there were a couple of studies in the last couple of years showing that intense targeted smell training, and we're talking 20 minutes, and it's a very cognitively demanding training of smell training per day, and within 6 weeks you see changes in the cortical matter. That is quite impressive. So the brain is kind of like a muscle, and I think if you're not really the fan of gym procedures and training, wine is a good alternative. I think we're kind of better here, and so I just tried to show you it's not subjective. It really has to do with skill.
So, Ann-Sophie, you just suggested that this is something we can learn. We can become better tasters. But so is that, we can actually quantify many things we do. We know that athletes. So if you're an athlete of tasting, as it were, if we draw a parallel there, we know that certain athletes are better than others at whatever it is that they're trying to do. Some people are faster at sprinting 100 meters. Some people can throw a javelin farther, or hit a baseball farther, or whatever it might be. Is it the tasters who provide what we can measure, or can we actually measure the wines themselves? Because I have this theory based upon spending a lot of time with people who enjoy wine and drink wine, that over time, the observation is that we begin to congregate around a certain number of wines, and we agree that there are certain wines that are, we like to think, objectively better than others. But I realize and write about the fact that there's a lot of subjectivity to that, in that our culture tells us so much about wines, and it's hard to, we can't drink wine outside of a cultural or even economic context. But is there any way to objectively grade wines themselves? Because I'd like to think that there's something objective to it. It's not simply acculturation. It's not just the tasters who become better. There's something in wine that has quality that is between acidity and fruit and tannin, that is the grip in your mouth, that give this wine a certain balance, and therefore and also complexity that is inherently attractive to the human brain, and therefore people tend to gravitate not towards the exact same wine, they can never agree on specifics, but towards the same group of wines as being the best wine.
So it's really not a either or. The nice thing is, when we talk about the objectivity of wine, it's both the sensory system allowing you to do certain discriminations, evaluations, and this is why it's so important to look for the underlying principles that allow us to do that. The other thing is also the material reality. So this is where there's two ways to speak about objectivity. One thing is what we are able to do. The other thing is what is there in terms of materials. And there is a certain objectivity when it comes to the quality and the composition of a wine. And this is what you see in the food industry. I mean, you actually, these are people in the research and development departments that make a certain objective basis for food products, including wine. And when it comes to wine, there are certain qualities that make a good wine, especially a good wine, as a certain kind of wine. Let's say this is kind of the good profile for a good Merlot. And this is partly in the sense that you could say there's a differentiation between being able to detect certain things as qualitatively higher, like there's a nice balance, for instance, there are certain notes signifying a wine as being a good representative example of, let's say, good Merlot, versus you might not like Merlot, but liking and the objectivity of tasting as evaluating the quality of a wine is not the same. I might say, oh, this is a wonderful Riesling. It has all these kind of features. It's just that I don't really like Riesling. So you can differentiate between liking and the quality of a wine as being of a particular standard. So I agree with you. There is both the ability to taste objectively, as well as having a certain quality of the things you're judging.
Well, we've given you a lot to swallow there. So how about I pass it back over to you, and I suspect you have some questions for us.
I have tons of questions, and I have to ask this one that just came in from Diane because it's so related to what we're talking about now. What about the consequence, right? So once you become this really athletically brained wine taster, what about that consequence that you can ruin the appreciation of wines that maybe you thought tasted good before, but now you realize weren't actually that great, and you can't go back to the box wine once you leave it?
I'm afraid that is true. That actually happened to me. I remember when I did an interview with a winemaker, and she gave me one of her best wines to taste, a wine I couldn't have possibly afforded in my kind of lower budget, where a bottle is like $500, and I had a little bit to taste. It was so divine. It was divine. And then a week later, I bought myself a wine. I was sitting in front of it, I was like, meh. So it happens. I'm afraid there is a price to pay for quality. Namely, it's hard to go back to certain kinds of wine that you thought previously fair enough, and now you think, yeah, but not really.
Chad, have you had that experience?
If I can just chime in a little bit there. I remember working in wine stores. I used to work with customers, and over the months that would go by, I'd sort of start them with, or if they came in, and this was back in the 90s, and so a lot of customers would say, oh, I like white Zinfandel. And I would say, okay, we offer some white Zinfandels. And then once they sort of trusted me, I would say, well, if you like white Zinfandel, maybe you want to try this. And I would lead them to a sort of a buttery California Chardonnay.
Mm.
And then they'd come back and say, oh, I really like that. And then maybe another month and a half later, I'd say, well, why don't you try this? And I'd lead them to, at that point, a big kind of jammy Merlot, which still had a lot of the fruit qualities that they wanted. But what you would see over time, a gravitation towards more complex wines, I would argue, things that were not simply sweet. And so I think that's, and then so yeah, once you've had other more complex flavors, I think it's tough to go back to White Zinfandel, for example. Sometimes also memory has a lot to do with it. You might be on a vacation somewhere, say in Southern Italy. This is important to imagine going places like that in COVID time, right? So here we are in Southern Italy, and you're drinking this wine that's just wonderful because you happen to be looking out at the Mediterranean Sea, and the food you're eating is wonderful, and the wine costs a pittance. And then you get home and you try to find that same wine, and you think, geez, that wasn't very good. So the location mattered dramatically in making the wine. So there's so much that goes on in tasting it and appreciating wine.
That's me in Rioja in Spain, coming back and then trying to have it here in North Carolina. Just did not give me the same the same feeling at all. Do you related to Hayden's questions here, Hayden, thank you so much for your questions. Do either of you have a favorite type of wine, and do you have a justification to back it up?
Sforzato. Sforzato is a beautiful northern Italian red wine, and it's made from dried grapes. This is why it's Sforzato with force. And it has such a beautiful velvety feeling to it, and it's got blackberries and tobacco and leather, and it just develops so nicely. I mean, Sforzato, it's not perhaps the cheapest wine, but it is divine.
Yeah, I like Amarone as well. Although the problem for me these days is Amarone is usually about 15-16% alcohol, so you can only have a glass before you have to go, or you not have any more, or you can have a big night, I guess. But yeah, it's a wonderful wine. For me, there are many wines I like, but I think over time I've sort of gravitated towards, it's sort of cliche, but Bordeaux and Burgundy. In part, well, I lived in Bordeaux a few years ago, researching the book that I'm writing now, and I got a little bit tired of the Bordeaux because that was just all around, and I almost sort of, I was Bordeauxed out.
Oh.
I became Bordeaux.
That is punishable.
Oh, no.
I'll stop the puns. So now I guess I'm preferring Burgundies, which is made of Pinot Noir. But Burgundy can be very frustrating because often it's not very ripe. It can be thin and acidic. And the problem with Burgundy is you often spend a lot of money on bottles that aren't very good just to get to that one elusive bottle that is really good. And then each time you have that bottle that's really good, you think, I'm going to have this again. But the next 5 bottles you have are misses. They're not a hit. And so Burgundy can be more frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like gambling. I can see the addiction.
And
there's so many good wines out there, though.
And what is the relationship between age and good wine? Is it always the case where an older wine is always going to be your better bet versus a newer wine? And why is that, or why not?
I guess I'll go first and let Ann-Sophie give the scientific perspective. Age does not always help. Certainly in the case of white wines, most white wines are made to be consumed quite young. Historically, the wines I was talking about in the Middle Ages, those were meant to be consumed within the year because they would become oxidized or acetified. So you didn't want either of those things. Age can matter, especially for red wines, although some whites, certainly sweet white wines, can age a very long time and often do change and become more complex over time. But so age can matter, especially if a wine is made with a lot of tannins. At the outset, those tannins, the things that grip your mouth, they have to kind of calm down, and they do calm down over time. So if it's a tannic wine to begin with, age can matter, but it has to then match up with the amount of fruit that's in the wine. If you wait for the tannins to calm down and the fruit is dead, then the wine isn't very good. So age matters, especially in Bordeaux. And that way it's sort of an old-fashioned product because it's not made for a market that wants immediate gratification. New World wines, California wines are better for drinking young, especially because they're more fruit forward, but some of them can age too. That said, there's a part of aging that is exaggerated, or there's a social component, for example, and a cultural component. So for example, I just said this is a 2011 Bordeaux. It's not very fancy. It's mostly Cab. It's 60% Cab, 30% Merlot, 7% Cabernet Franc, 3% Petit Verdot. So a good Bordeaux blend, but it's not a fancy wine, and that blend is typical. But what's not fancy about it is the grade of it. It's a cru bourgeois. So a middle class wine. They come out and tell you. 2011 for Cru Bourgeois is 10 years now on it, or 9.5, given where we are in calendar when you make your wine. It's actually, if it's well made, that's good, and it's going to have some flavor changes that are going to occur. It'll be a little bit smoother on the palate. But let's just say this was a 2001 and it was an expensive wine. Mm-hmm. One of the things I'd be doing is the wine would improve. But what am I doing socially too? Well, I'm telling you that let's just say this was a 2001, but very high quality, and now it's worth on the market $500 to $600. Someone's going to pay that for it. Well, what I'm saying by drinking it and opening it, and what makes it better in some ways, is that it's a status symbol. Because what have I done? I've either said I've got $500 I can spend on the wine, or I've said I bought that wine when it was young and I spent $70 on it and I sat on it for that long. Mm-hmm. That says something about my own patience, my own self-control, and the fact that I can take $70 and simply sit on it and not have it earn anything for me, except for the pleasure of having a wonderful wine when it's older. So there is something in the flavor of wine, absolutely, that changes over time. Sometimes for the worse. For better made wines, especially red wines, with greater extraction and greater care, they do often improve. But there's that cultural and social component where you're making a statement about yourself with the wine that can be both snobby and doesn't necessarily add anything to the taste of the wine.
I think that's a pretty comprehensive explanation. Let me just at least give an example from white wine, where after a while, older white wine is not often, it depends on the wine basically, but bring it back to Riesling, just to say, like, aged Riesling often has developed a component called TDN, which has this petrol diesel smell. So yeah, it depends really on the wine. It depends what it does to the wine. And so there is no general answer necessarily. Awesome. And it's not that somebody poured diesel or petrol into the wine. It's a molecule that has the odor of petrol that develops in there, or the odor of what we associate with petrol.
And it can be quite pronounced in diesel. And interestingly, even if you wouldn't, in Riesling, and yes. Even if you would think you would never want to actually drink diesel, sure enough, when you have it, you think to yourself, this is kind of attractive. It's going to be a very nice flavor in the mouth.
It's almost like body odor. It can be either disgusting if you're in New York in the metro and you've got the armpit in front of you, but in certain romantic encounters, it can be nice. This is like smell depends on context.
Right. It goes back to that scene in the Mediterranean once again.
Yeah.
Well, we have so many more questions. We can't get to all of them. We can sit here for another 6 hours and talk to you both about your expertise. And thank you so much again. I also want to quickly plug, Chad has 2 books out and is working on another one, as you alluded to. The Politics of Wine in Britain, A New Cultural History and Food Fights, How the Past Matters in Contemporary Food Debates. Ann-Sophie has out Smellosophy, What the Nose Tells the Mind. So if you're interested in learning more about their expertise in these topics, please look up those books. I'll throw them in an email afterwards too. And yeah, thank you both again so much. Sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Michelle, if people have questions that weren't answered, and I realize there are quite a few. I see a lot. I believe you can find my email on the NC State website, and I guess I'll volunteer. Ann-Sophie's on the Indiana University website.
Yes.
And
it should be, unless they fired me in the last 5 minutes, it should be still there. Yes.
So, and we'd be happy to answer your questions that way, since we haven't had time today in this session. So please.
So the floodgates are open from here on out. And before we leave, I just want to quickly plug for February 25th. We have Chef Olia Hercules is joining us. I heard Olia on NPR's Splendid Table back in August, and she recently wrote a book about summer kitchens in Ukraine, and how in those summer kitchens, there's a whole load of fermented goods and recipes that are traditional to that area. She's going to share some of those recipes with us. Those include things like apples pickled in pumpkin puree, whole watermelons fermented in wooden barrels, etc. So tune in for that one too in 2 weeks. And otherwise, yeah, go stretch your wine muscles in your brains. I'm going to go do that right now. And until then, February 25th, hope you're all safe and well, and take care.